Welcome to this episode of Stitch Lab, where we are experimenting sewing with knit fabrics. Sewing with knits is just as easy as pulling on a knit garment. And just like knits stretch, so do your seams when you sew them. Now, there's no one way to sew knit fabrics together, but there are a couple essential tools and practices that you will need to know. We are also joined by expert indie pattern designer Adrianna Appl to join us in all these knit fabric experiments.
Hi, I'm Amanda Carestio.
I'm Kate Zeinard.
And I'm Meg Healy.
We are the hosts of the Sew and Tell podcast, and we are very excited to start a new series for you called Stitch Lab. In each episode, we are going to cover essential techniques and present inspiring experiments.
I need to put my safety glasses on for this experiment.
Aha.
Oh, great. Wonderful.
That was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be.
Wow.
Welcome to Stitch Lab.
We have a very special guest today. Adrianna Appl is joining us in the lab to talk about knits. So introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your sewing history.
Hi everybody, I'm Adrianna Appl. I started sewing like many of you when I quit my job and had my first kid and was a little bit bored and wanted to make cute outfits for my daughter. So I started there, self-taught. Eventually that morphed into starting my own pattern making business. I was able to take classes and now I work full-time at Hey June Handmade. That's my company and I'm from right here in Golden, Colorado.
I'm a big fan of Hey June Handmade. I have to say, your patterns are amazing, and they're like on trend, but classic and kind of timeless. And I think, being out there in the online sewing community, there's so much love. There's a whole month dedicated to them, right?
Well, the company was named after my daughter, Juniper, so hence the June. But
right.
June took over, so I'm like, I'll take it.
So let's first talk about the difference between knits and wovens. People new to sewing or unfamiliar with different fabric types, you can just think of fabric as fabric, but there are two classifications and you need to sew with them a bit differently. And basically one stretches and one doesn't. So wovens, their fibers are woven, and knits stretch because the yarns are interlooped. So a woven here, it's just not stretchy. You'll see knits kind of unravel instead of fray. So you'll get some stretch to them. So that's basically the fundamentals. Easy. One stretches and one doesn't. So what are our favorite knits to sew with and work with and even wear?
I'm not too picky. I kind of love most of them. When I started sewing with knits, I definitely started on the more stable end of the spectrum, like some cotton blends, definitely French terry, things like that, really kind of act almost more like a woven, so they were a little bit easier to get used to. But now I pretty much sew everything. If it's soft and not too drapey or sheer, I'll probably sew with it.
I'm the same way.
Yeah.
And actually my favorite stuff to sew is my favorite stuff to wear, because why spend all the time sewing if you're not going to wear it? Unfortunately, my favorite knits, like you're saying, are soft and have a little bit of drape, which makes them a little bit more difficult to sew with sometimes, but the result is always worth it.
How about you, Meg?
Oh, well, you know what I'm going to bring out. Neon spandex for sure.
That's such a fun color. I love that.
It's perfect.
But I love how you brought up, just to touch on stable knits and versus super stretchy knits, because there is a stretch factor and a percentage of stretch. I have this guide that I shop with, and you'll see a lot of times on different knit patterns, they recommend different stretch percentages. You're not going to sew kind of a t-shirt in the same knit that you're going to sew kind of a bathing suit, let's say. So you can easily find out the percentage by folding each grain in half and then lining up pins and seeing how much it will stretch. And that's just based on there's spandex in it or kind of the fibers that it's made of. So just a little bit more into knits, but neon spandex is my favorite.
That's so you.
Yeah.
I love that you carry that around with you. That's so nerdy. I love it.
Oh,
It's such a handy resource.
Yeah, especially when you're fabric shopping. I just cut this out and then have it on a piece of cardboard and in my purse. And so I can know if it's something suitable or not, because you can kind of, you don't really know when you stretch. I mean, eventually you might be able to just tell without it, but I just like to always have it on me for sure.
I love that. You know, I have a quick question for Adrianna. Do you prefer creating patterns for knits or wovens? Do you have a favorite?
Ooh, so that kind of aligns with what I like to sew. So pattern making for wovens is so much easier because there's not that variance. So you don't have any question marks involved. If it's this size, it's this size, no matter what. So I would say it's easier to create patterns for wovens, but knits have my heart. They were my first thing. They were my first pattern that I ever made was for knits. For a long time, I only made knit patterns.
Wow.
And it's what I wear every day. It's what we all wear every day.
Yeah.
So all this knit talk is wanting me to start sewing and diving into the best practices and some sort of tips for knits. So, Amanda, do you have a tip for cutting out knits? Because it's a little bit different than wovens.
Absolutely. You can completely cut out knits with scissors, but it is a lot easier with a rotary cutter. When you use scissors with knits, you kind of have to lift the fabric up to cut the pieces, and that can distort your pattern pieces and also create an uneven line. But with a rotary cutter, it's super fast, super easy.
Much easier.
I hate to say must have because I feel like I want everybody to sew what they want to sew, but I do feel like a rotary cutter makes life a lot easier.
I think you should set yourself up for success when you're doing something that maybe you're not fully comfortable with, and this is the best way to have success, on your first go.
That's a great point. There are a couple of other special items that will help set you up for success when you are sewing knits, and I have to say that I am not a needle stickler. That's kind of a pun, right?
I love it.
There you go. We can add that to my official tally. But when you're sewing with knits, you really want to have a ballpoint needle. I think I tried to skip this part, but you will get skipped stitches. You will create holes in your fabric.
Yep.
A traditional kind of universal needle is designed to pierce the fabric, and the ballpoint needle kind of slides in between the fibers. If you pierce the fiber of a knit fabric and then stretch it, those holes just grow and grow and grow. So if you're seeing that happening on your makes, then you know it's probably time to invest and switch your needle out. And there's also another needle that comes in handy with knits.
Yes, I always need my twin needle. Another pun for you.
There we go.
Yes, a twin needle is, and you can also get them in, there's twin needles for wovens and twin needles for stretch. So there is ballpoint and different widths as well. So twin needle gives that professional finish on your regular sewing machine, that double needle effect in only one stitch. And it zigzags in the back, the bobbin thread zigzags, and it stretches to hem all of your knits in a really professional and easy manner. So you just thread up 2 threads at the top. It's the same bobbin, and just swap out your needle. And you may need to look into your own sewing machine's instruction manual to see the twin needle mode. There's sometimes a button or a setting that you need to do. And stitch from the right side, not from the wrong side. Yeah, so now that we've discussed everything that we need, I see, Amanda, you have some lovely green knit fabric in front of you.
It's green.
Let's dive into some experiments. We have some different options and things that you can do to set yourself up for sewing knits success. To the lab.
To the lab. Okay, we've talked a little bit about knits so far, but one of the things that really comes into play with knits is that you cannot use a standard straight stitch. You're really going to have to use some of those stretch stitches on your machine. But if you want to see what happens if you use a straight stitch on a knit hem, we can show you, because this has happened to me on garments while I've been wearing them.
Oh yeah, you hear that little crinkle and pop, and you know something's gone wrong.
Shall we give it a shot? This is just a straight stitch through some knits. Ready?
Oh, I heard that.
Did you hear it?
I did.
Oh, so you can see, yeah, that was pretty dramatic.
It's not a good day.
Yeah, if this happens on a shirt that you're wearing, it's not ideal. So you are going to need to become pretty comfortable with your stretch stitches on your machine. Do you have a favorite stretch stitch on your machine that you like to use?
For me, it depends on if it's a construction stitch or a hem.
Right.
For construction, I really love the triple. It's very sturdy, it's easy to sew, and it's very reliable.
Yep. How about you, Meg?
Yeah, I like the stretch stitch. So it's like, it's not a full zigzag. It's like a narrower zigzag. So I don't like a a stitch that's too thick, because then it doesn't lay as flat, I feel, when I, press it open.
All right, well, let's talk about a few of the stretch stitches available on this machine, because there's actually quite a few. And one of them is one you mentioned, Adrianna, the triple stitch here. I like this one too, because it looks kind of the most like a straight regular stitch that you would do on a woven, but it does have that nice stretch ability.
Yeah.
And this is really great for seaming, because it does create that nice flat seam. Another great one that I use pretty often for hemming is just kind of an elongated zigzag stitch.
Yes.
Again, it still has quite a bit of stretch involved with it, and yeah, that's a favorite of mine for a quick hem option.
No pop stitches.
No pop stitches, look at that.
Yes.
This is actually the slant over edge stitch, and this creates a nice straight seam here, but it does provide a little bit of support to that seam allowance, so it's not gonna ravel or fray. It's got a nice amount of stretch to it, and I think it's a really great option for seaming. I actually haven't used this one as much, but it is
Nice and clean.
it's nice and clean.
Yes.
So let's look at a few additional options available on this machine for stretch stitches. The first one that I want to experiment with is the overlock stitch. This actually functions pretty similar to a serger stitch. It's got a lot of stretch to it, and it also does provide a little bit of support for that seam allowance. It's a nice strong stretch stitch, and it's a great option. Okay. And just to mention, I am using red thread here, so you can see these stitches really clearly, but nice amount of stretch. You get that nice straight seam here. Really great option. I really like it.
That one's probably nice for construction and hemming, because it doesn't give a ripple effect on the
It's so true. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
nice
Yeah.
and clean.
Speaking of hems, there is another stitch that I wanted to try out on this machine, and I haven't used it very much, so bear with me a little bit, but it is the Picot hem stitch.
Ooh.
And it's a nice decorative option, I think, because, I think with hemming, that might be the harder step with those really visible stitches. So I'm gonna give this a go, and we'll see how it works, but essentially it's gonna create little tufts on the hem.
Oh, how fun!
Like a little shell design.
Like a little shell,
that's
yeah.
beautiful. I
Like a
like that.
scallop.
Exactly.
Scallop.
All right. That's pretty cute.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's a fun little scallop shape.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with a little bit of steam, this will lay a little bit flatter and you'll see a little bit more of that kind of scalloped edge. Also, if you were using a matching thread, the thread wouldn't be so front and center. It'd be more about those little bumps. But I think it's pretty cute. I want to experiment a little bit more with it, but I think that's a really great hem finish option.
And it stretches great.
It stretches great. A little bit of decorative option too, I think.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, that's so cool. It makes me want to just open my machine and look at all of my options I never use. I usually use decorative stitches or different finishes for wovens, but I've never thought about it for knits.
Oh, and one last tip when you are experimenting with the Picot hem stitch, make sure that when it has that bigger zigzag, you're going actually off the edge of the fabric. That's a little bit tricky and a little bit
It's hard to do.
counterintuitive, but that'll give you that nice little puff. So yeah, more experimenting.
And speaking of an experiment, what if I could tell you you could sew a straight stitch on your machine and it will not pop?
Let's see it.
We'll have to see it.
Well, you can actually find stretch thread. It's like little elastic thread, but it's not totally elastic. You can kind of see it
A
stretches.
little bit of give.
Yes. And you wind your bobbin in it as well. It's just as thin as thread. It's not that kind of cording elastic that you have to hand wind. We hate to do that. So you thread it as normal and straight stitch. I didn't adjust any settings, and I'm just going to try stitching a seam. I have some French terry here. You can back stitch in it, pivot, everything. Wow, look.
Look at that.
It's a straight stitch and it does not pop.
That's awesome. Now, what is that thread called again?
It's called Ep.6 thread.
Okay.
I believe a couple of brands carry it, but this is by Coats, so you can find it. And it's in many different colors.
I have to try
obviously
that.
I know.
using a green. It's very cool. So it's great for beginners, because if you're intimidated by switching up different settings, or learning a different stitch other than the straight, but you can give it a try.
Oh, I want to experiment with that next.
Sounds great.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about installing knit neckbands, because I think that can really intimidate people, but it's not a hard process.
It's actually quite simple, and I'm gonna run you through a little demo here, see how it's done. So we're gonna sew a knit neckband to a knit t-shirt, and I have a sample here to show you. What I've done so far is I've quartered the neckband and I've quartered the shirt. And the most important thing to remember is that your shoulder seam is not usually on the quarter, so don't automatically put it there. As you can see, it's about 2 inches down on this neckband. So the first thing that we're gonna do is come to our machine, and I'm going to place the neckband on top. So I'm sewing on the right side of my shirt. I'm gonna slide it under my presser foot. I'm gonna fix my seam allowance. I'm gonna put my needle down. I'm starting at the back neck seam, and I'm gonna start sewing, and the important thing is that you stretch the neckband to fit the edge of the shirt. So I'm not actually stretching the neckline of the shirt, only the neckband. And then you're gonna use your seam allowance and you're gonna sew around the entire thing. So I finished sewing the neckband on, but you're not finished sewing the neckband until you press it. It's a crucial step with knits. As you can see, it's kind of wavy and it's a little bit gathered in places. So your next step is to use the tension from your ironing board to kind of slide it up there, keep the seam allowances pressed away from the neckband, and then if you would like to press that for me,
Yep.
I will put this back on.
Okay.
I took this off while I was sewing because I wanted more space to be able to maneuver the neckband around the swing arm of the sewing machine.
Now, Amanda, what iron setting do you have? It's not like a full blast heat, do you?
This is on cotton, which I think, I think you just kind of go based on what your fabric makeup is. Mm-hmm. And I don't linger too long.
No, I usually just steam it.
You just steam it?
Yeah, you can give it a little bit of a press, but the most important thing is to
steam.
Steam it and make sure everything's lying. And you can already see it's lying much nicer.
Much flatter.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't know that you can actually press knits. I know when I first started, I thought they would just melt away or something. I mean, some can, but
you have to be very careful with your iron settings with knits. And sometimes it's nice to use a press cloth as well because you can make iron marks on your fabric, which isn't great.
I've done that before.
Oh, yeah.
Much better already.
Yeah, so it looks nice and clean. And then the last thing you want to do is just flip that seam allowance down and come in with one of your stretch stitches. And you could use one of your pretty decorative ones here if you want. And just tack that seam allowance down so it doesn't flip back up, but you're gonna have a nice, neat neckband.
I always use a twin needle finish for doing all of my neckband top stitches.
I love that.
And this is the same application if you want to add sleeve bands, a hem band. Basically, this is any knit band. The band will generally be smaller than the hole that it's finishing. But yeah, that was a fantastic tip. I love that. Now we have a little, what are those called? A dickie.
That's right.
That's right.
Be very cropped.
So you've learned a little bit about sewing on your regular sewing machine, but if you really take to loving sewing knits, you might consider actually getting a serger. I mean, you'll still need a sewing machine, but a serger finishes those seams really fast and they also stretch. So you're going to sew knits in half the time and they are going to be just a little bit more secure and you can do so many other things. So just think about a serger in conjunction with your regular sewing machine. But you cannot top stitch, do a zigzag stitch on your serger. So you do need both.
I have 2 regrets when it comes to sewing knits. And one is that I thought that I had to have a serger before I sewed knits. And as you can see, you can get really far with them. And my other regret is that it took me so long to get a serger because now I love it. And it is really great for knits. It's that much quicker.
I always tell people buy your sewing machine first, then your serger, and if you really want to get creative, your cover stitch.
I think that's great words of advice.
Yes, for sure. Oh, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much, Adrianna, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, you shared your expertise, and I love the first pattern that you designed was for a knit. So you're a perfect fit to give us all your tips and tricks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, we covered a lot of knit topics today. We talked a little bit about the special tools and techniques you need to use if you're more comfortable working with wovens and now you want to start working with knits. We covered some stretch stitches and when to use them. We did a neckband install, and then we talked about upgrading to a serger.
Yes, I really do want to try sewing more top stitching and hemming options. It's just so much more beyond than your regular zigzag or a twin needle.
Right.
So you can get really creative for sure.
Right. There's so many stitches that I haven't even tried yet, but I definitely want to jump back in with that picot hem stitch. I think it's really cute and it's a really fun option for finishing those knit edges.
Yeah. Do you have a next knit project on the brain that you're going to cut out next?
I don't know, you were talking about a swimsuit and now I kind of have that on the brain.
Oh, nice. I already have one cut out, but my next one is a knit wrap dress. I really want one.
Oh, that is going to be so pretty and so comfortable.
This has been the Stitch Lab for sewing with knit fabrics. Thanks for joining us. We had so much fun, and thanks for tuning in.